Hey everyone, welcome back to another chess video. So for this one we're going to take a look at opposite colored bishops and why this endgame is usually a draw. And so here, I've set up opposite colored bishops, and I really just want to get right into it really quickly because we have a lot to cover, and it's a very simple endgame, but it's simple only if you know the details. And so let's explain why it's so often a draw and how it's really easy to hold that draw in most cases. But I'm also going to show an example where the draw actually isn't there and one side can actually win. So before we actually get to this position here, I'll go back to a different position, and it's a little bit simpler because this we have the opposite color bishops, the exact endgame that we want, but I'm going to make it even more simple than that. I'm going to show a position with just one bishop, and so I'm going to try and explain some of the key ideas for each side, and then we'll put the other bishop onto the board, and we'll see how this endgame plays a little bit differently. So here, if you have the bishop, obviously you're going to have a bishop if this is an opposite color bishop endgame. You have to look at a few key ideas. And so one of the key ideas is what's called a blockade. So the nice thing about pawns is, they control many good squares, especially if they're next to each other. Like if this pawn had advanced, to this square, d5, then these pawns work really well together and they control a lot of key squares. And because of that, they can be very useful, especially together in this pawn duo when they're next to each other. But when they're in some kind of pawn chain like here, the problem is because pawns attack diagonally, they leave a lot of other squares weak. And so in this case, all these light squares here would be very weak for these pawns to cover. And we just so happen to have a light squared bishop in this position. So what this means is we can actually literally form a blockade, and it stops all these pawns from advancing. So this is a really good defensive technique that you're going to see in this endgame a lot. So like one move could possibly be like this bishop c6 check. But even if it's not a check, it doesn't really matter. It's the fact that we're stopping all of these pawns from advancing. Because these pawns can, of course, never advance. Our bishop would just go to whichever square that pawn moves to, take it for free, and then return back. And all these pawns are frozen by this one bishop. Same thing where we're actually stopping these pawns. So, this is like the ideal square for this bishop. And it can more or less sit there if it has the opportunity to do so. So that's one idea where a bishop can try and hold a draw, even against many pawns, even if one side is losing in material. Oftentimes when you get to a pawn endgame, just one extra pawn is usually enough to win. But in this case, with opposite color bishops, or any bishop like what we have here, this isn't necessarily the case, because the bishop can keep shuffling, keep holding the blockade, and there's simply no way to make progress. Now another idea that's really important to know before we get to the opposite color bishop one is whenever you reach the king and pawn endgame, oftentimes the idea is you're going to try and provoke the other side to run out of moves. This is called Zugzwang, when they literally have no good moves available. And oftentimes you'll try and get king opposition at that exact moment. And then your opponent is forced to move, make a king move, some move that's apparently losing. You're advancing your king up, keeping opposition in some certain way. And then, you're eventually making ground and you're hopefully going to win that endgame. The problem is when there's any bishop on the board, there's no possibility of Zugzwang because a bishop can just keep shuffling between squares and it doesn't really give up much on the position, especially if it's blockading pawns in the process. And so when we have an opposite colored bishop endgame, both sides, can do that because both sides have a bishop. And so it's really impossible to create Zugzwang, and oftentimes those endgames are a draw. Now, I'll go through this position here. We'll just kind of show a little bit further just how this is a very simple draw you just hold. So we could have like king e7, we could just keep the blockade, but it's important to know why I'm choosing to stay on this diagonal. Because if you just shuffle just because, you might actually let these pawns get a little too far advanced, and next thing you know, you might actually be losing if the pawns get too far ahead. So the reason I'm staying on this diagonal specifically is because these are the most dangerous pawns. These are the pass pawns. And the reason they're more dangerous is because notice these two pawns, I'm not really worried about them because those are in theory blocked by these pawns over here. So they're not really passed. Eventually they're going to meet our pawns, we'll exchange or we'll block them, and they won't be able to make progress. I really want to keep shuffling along these and especially keep these pawns guarded if possible. So, let's say that, they keep trying, maybe try and prepare something like c6. And so we can, advance our king up. But even if they get c6, even if they try and disrupt us, move our bishop, and then start advancing these pawns, even this is usually not enough to win, against the bishop here. Because what's going to happen is, even if I somehow drop the blockade, I can always come back and establish it on a new diagonal, Or I can do another pattern, which is the one I'm going to show here, whereas if they start advancing a little too much, I can start to attack the base of their pawn chain. Here we have these pawns, and the very bottom of it, this pawn on c6, that's defending the pawn chain. Like, if we imagine this pawn here, it's the same idea, where this pawn over here, it's going to, this is the base on c6, and as Nimzovich said, you attack the pawns at their, weak point, which is the pawn base, the base of the pawn chain. So here I'm just aiming at c6 and provoking them to move or something, or at the very least defend it with their king, like what they're doing. And it's going to be very difficult for them to keep advancing. Now, if they do try something like c5, we have enough to defend. We just play b3 because we want to keep them from making a pass pawn, so we do not want them to push. If they try and push anyway, trying to force a pass pawn, hoping like this exchange here, maybe then this pawn will be, a little bit more dangerous with them hoping to promote. But the thing is, we always have our king, and our king is a very nice defender. Here, like if we do exchange, we just play a4. And this is a very instructional move, because here I have one pawn, but this is actually stopping two of their pawns, because this pawn is blocked. This is what's called a pawn ram. They're just right in front of each other, and none of them can advance. And then this pawn can't advance, because of course I would take that pawn. And so they, just because of this, it's very draw looking already, even if you didn't know this, type of endgame. So we just keep shuffling. And that's the problem with the bishops, we just shuffle. And our king is going to come back because this is the dangerous pass pawn. And so the idea is we're going to have our king try and block the promotion square or get in front of that pawn. And the other pawn over here that's also kind of dangerous, our bishop can always deal with that. Here we have this diagonal always covered, and hopefully we'll have a way that they can't make progress. And so I'll show you what this would look like. We can keep shuffling our bishop. They can advance, doesn't matter. We get our king to defend. They can advance the pawn, and then we just keep shuffling our bishop. And, if they keep advancing, that's no problem. And we just keep shuffling. And the idea is here, this square is controlled. And so they can't advance their pawn safely. And so what do? Well, they have to play a king move. And when they play a king move, well, we just shuffle somewhere along this diagonal and control, all these squares, stopping this pawn from advancing, stopping this pawn from advancing, and it also keeps this pawn guarded, just so happens to be here in this position. So we just play somewhere here, keep the blockade going, and they have no better but to try and go back and repeat. And we'll just go here and we'll just get a draw by threefold repetition. No problem. They'll basically have to come back and we have the exact same thing. Now, if they don't play king c3, and if they try and get a little too ambitious, let's say they go king to a3, they could actually lose this game. Because if they try and get too fancy, then we'll win this pawn, and then we'll try and win the other pawn, too far out of play, we're definitely going to get this pawn. And then they can try and come up, but our plan is very simple. We're going to try and get our king to their pawn base. Remember, this is always defending each other, so the enemy king can never touch them. And then we'll win this pawn, and then our a pawn will be the key to this whole endgame and be our asset that'll help us win. So I'll show real briefly what this would look like. Something like this, and there's just no way that they could save the pawn. We'll advance, and then we'll keep promoting. Keep going all the way to promotion. And then here, Stockfish actually sees mate in 7, which is actually kind of cool. I'll show real briefly that line here. It would look like this. But even if your technique isn't as exact as the computer, the point is, a queen is good enough to win, even without this bishop. The fact the bishop here is just easier, more like overkill, really. You don't even need it. But something like that could happen if the other side is not careful. But here, they're probably just going to keep going back, keep shuffling. And this is how a bishop tries a blockade. So you can see how good of a defender this bishop is in the endgame, especially a pawn endgame. Now let's go back to our opposite color bishops, and you'll see what the problem is. The problem is both sides have a bishop. And in this position, I tried to give the advantage to white in every single way I could. I gave white an extra pawn because I wanted them to have extra material, make it look like they have winning chances. I even tried to give our bishop here for white what's called a good bishop, because this bishop is on the opposite color squares of all of our pawns. I put all of the pawns on dark squares, and this bishop is on a light square, which makes this a good bishop, because none of the pawns are actually blocking our bishop. So this bishop is free to move to all of these squares all over the board, and it's never going to be restricted by one of their own pawns. Similarly, I gave black what's called a bad bishop. I try to box it in as much as possible. It's on the same color squares as all of their pawns, and their king is even in the way. And so I did all of this to try and give, white a huge advantage here. I gave white a better bishop. The kings are both relatively equally active. I even gave white an extra pawn. So many things in their favor, you would think. But if you know this endgame, this is a very easy draw. And as we can see by the engine, it's pretty close to equal. And we'll go through this example as well. We'll show that even with all these advantages, that white has, normally you would think would be enough to win. The problem is the defending bishop can just keep shuffling, and there isn't really an easy way to make progress. So if we go with this position, we'll just have white advance because it's always instructional to try and get your king towards the center, a little more active in the endgame. Ideally, what we would want is to try and get to either this pawn or this pawn, because this c7 pawn is their pawn base. It's helping support both of these pawns over here. So that would be a nice pawn to get to if our king could win that pawn. And similarly, the h6 pawn would also be nice, because if we can win this pawn, then these two pawns will become passed, and those could be very strong in the endgame. So here, they'll advance, they're not going to let us get there, and we can try and establish the same blockade if we really wanted. These pawns would be nice to block, so we just put our bishop in front, and we just try and hold them back as much as possible. Now, they can try and stop us from holding the blockade, very similar to what we saw in the last example of c6. They can try and push us here and provoke us to, leave this diagonal because they don't want us to maintain the blockade. But this is no problem because for the defender, they're still holding, and even with white's advantages, they don't really have a way to make progress because the bishops can just keep shuffling. And so, we can oftentimes give a check, try and bring our king up. They can try and give another check and try and force us out. And the king will, just move on over. But eventually, our king isn't going to make it up, we can see here. Because, this square, it's a dark square. They could always have their bishop control it if they really wanted to. Same thing here. This square is also controlled. Their king is always going to keep kind of close. So basically, they're sort of boxing us out. And our king really isn't going to get up, that part of the board if it's, going to try. Black is going to have to allow that at some point. So it looks like it's kind of being a draw already, even if you didn't know about the opposite color bishops. But let's say that they play c5. Let's say that they're trying to play actively. They're trying to break open the pawns, trying to make progress somehow. Then white would just take, black can take, and then say white is trying to push for a win. They have the extra pawn, why not? They play b4. And they're trying to create a pass pawn, because if black does nothing, then this pawn here is going to just advance and try and promote. And if black takes it, well, then we just replace it with the capture, and we still are threatening to try and run all the way and promote. And so this is, white's decent attempt to win, but even here it's not enough because we'll just exchange. Very similar to what we had in the first example, the defending king is going to try and stop the pass pawn, so they're going to move over there. We'll move our king up. They don't want to drop a pawn, so they're going to defend it while getting a little closer to this, passer on the b file. We'll advance because pass pawns are meant to be pushed. That's a good general rule. But now they can keep giving annoying checks, which is one of the key defending things to bishop. You just keep shuffling, you just keep checking, and you try and maintain any pawn blockades if possible. We can just come back, they'll repeat, we do the same, they repeat, and we can see it's very difficult to make progress. Now, if we're trying to play for a win, we don't want to go back because that'd be a threefold repetition. So then we'll play something like king to d3 and try and get a different position, but they're going to get closer to our pawn. And what we can do is we can try and counterattack by we can play like bishop f3 so that if they take our pawn, we take their pawn. That's just an equal trade. But, again, they'll just keep shuffling and trying to keep our king out because this stops our king from advancing to any of these squares. The pawn, is controlling these squares. We can see how black is trying to keep white's king out and trying to keep them from advancing up the board. So with all this being said, we'll try b6, trying to force the trade, see if we can make progress that way, because obviously our white king wasn't advancing. So now we're going to try and go after this pawn, but they can still try and defend, both with their bishop and their king. So they can try and come over there as we get over there. Gain a tempo on our bishop. Didn't really matter though, because there are plenty of time to get to this pawn. And we can keep trying to advance and keep pushing, but we're not going to make progress here because they can just keep shuffling with the bishop, very similar to what we could do. And we could keep advancing pawns, fine, doesn't really matter. We'll keep going up. They force our pawn up because they were attacking it. But now we see the defending idea. They've established the blockade. They just play bishop d8, and they'll just keep shuffling on this diagonal. It's very difficult to make progress here. This pawn can't advance because, of course, you take it. And the same thing where our king can't really get in. This pawn is easily defended. And this is the kind of thing that you'll see very often in these type of endgames. So this is really why opposite color bishop endgames are almost always a draw. In fact, it's actually more the exception and the thing that's celebrated when one side can push for a win. Oftentimes one pawn isn't enough. Even two pawns is enough. Sometimes even three pawns advantage isn't enough if they have opposite color bishops. When you start getting 3 and 4 pawns up, Usually there might be some way that you can overload the bishop, but even then, sometimes it's still a draw. And this is very different because normal pawn, king, and pawn endgames, or even with another piece, like say a rook endgame with pawns, one pawn might be enough to convert into a win. But opposite color bishops, because they can keep shuffling and holding the blockade, it's very difficult to defend, or sorry, very difficult to keep attacking, and they have a really easy defense, for both sides. So we can move our bishop, but they can just keep shuffling this diagonal, it doesn't matter, and we have no way to make progress. So this is why opposite color bishops are oftentimes a draw. Now, I wouldn't make this a whole video just on that. I want to show an example where one side can win. So let's take a look at what it would look like when they're trying to push for a win. So here in this position, very similar to what we looked at before, opposite color bishops here. However, in this position, white is actually slightly better and probably going to win. And so what is the difference here? Because it looks very similar to the last one that we had. But the difference here is we have this outside passer on the A file. And this pawn is really nice because it's going to tie down their bishop. And what's going to happen is sometimes these endgames, really it's about position more than material. Really, if you're going to take any one thing from this video, it's opposite color bishops. They're usually a draw, but position is everything. It could be equal material. You could be up material. You could even be down a pawn. It doesn't really matter. It's the value of the bishops and how active they are. And in this case, this bishop is going to get stuck defending this pawn, and we're going to try and restrict its mobility. And if we can do that, then the bishop isn't as good at defending. It still takes a lot of work. It still might be a draw. But in this case, there's barely enough for white to try and win. So here, white is a pawn up. Past pawns are meant to be pushed. And so we advance. We're trying to promote if they do nothing. Now, next, they're going to want the bishop to come to d8. And so why do we use the bishop as the defending side? The reason we use the bishop is because here, notice that black's king is going to want to defend this pawn. This king is going to be needed over here on this side of the board, somewhere along these squares, and we're going to try and keep this king out. Because if they were to do nothing, say the king were to go this way and try and stop the pawn, even if they're in time to catch this pawn, what's going to happen is the white king is just going to kind of scoot on over this way, and we're going to win this pawn. Now the h pawn will be a passer, and they can't stop two pass pawns on opposite sides of the board. It's just too much ground for them to cover. They won't be able to make it in time. You can't be in two places at once. The king could only be here or here. Can't stop both of them. And so the king has to go to one, and the bishop has to go to the other. So in this case, the king is actually better to try and guard this pawn. So by process of elimination, the bishop is probably going to have to try and stop this pawn from promoting. So the way to do that is bishop d8, because all these squares were controlled by our pawns. They did a nice job there. And so we're going to have to try and stop the a pawn by something like bishop d8, try and stop this by blockade. So they push, bishop b6, and they're going to try and blockade this pawn. Very same idea we looked at in the first example, and they're going to try and defend that way. Now we'll advance. We play king to e8. And with king e8, we're advancing the king, and we're threatening these two squares. And we'll see why this is important later, specifically the d5 square. But in some lines, the king might also go to f5. So we'll kind of keep that in mind. King will come up because the king is going to try and keep our king out. They're going to try and stop us from going here. Like if we go here, they might shadow us. And, if we try and go this way, they might go this way. And they're going to try and hold on to this pawn that was vulnerable. Because if they can hold on to this pawn can't make progress. And, there's very little they can do to try and push for a win. So now we have a really nice move. We have pawn to c4. And this is a really cool move because we're threatening to play c5. And when we threaten this, we're threatening to kick the bishop back with tempo. And so this is a really strong idea that black has to do something about. So what's probably best is for black to play back bishop to a7. And bishop a7 is just trying to get out of the way so c5 doesn't come with an attack. Now, an interesting alternative maybe is you could consider, well, what's another way to stop c5? Maybe they could play c5 themselves. And so if they play c5 themselves, that stops this pawn from advancing. But now, the problem is, you can't take. Because if you take, the blockade is still maintained, and they just can't make progress. This only helps the defending side. They're still defending here. And now this pawn is also stopped. We're really just helping the defending side, with the bishop here. And so, what do? Well, the key idea is if they tried c5, you push d5. And this is why our king needed to be on e4 to begin with. We're just going to advance, and now these central pawns can be very dangerous. So what could happen is, like, they could trade. We could take, play bishop to a7. and then we play d6. And we're just going to keep advancing in the center. Now, if their king comes up, this is actually a checkmate. So they have to be very careful. Even though there's so few things on the board, the game could end very quickly if they're not careful. So let's say they don't walk into checkmate. Say the king comes back. Well, now I play king d5, and we're just going to try and advance and keep going with our central pawns. Try and create a pass pawn and win the game that way. The king is going to go over, try and defend. We can play our bishop. And even if they come back, this is really cool. It's not the only move. We, probably could push something like this, but I think this is the most clean, very, instructional. We can sacrifice material because it's more important that we have the position than it is even our bishop. So if we sacrifice the bishop here, these pawns are so strong. Black cannot defend all of these. They're going to have to come back. We'll advance our king. And if they move the king over, then they're going to lose because we'll play king c7, and there's no way they can stop this in time. Now, if they don't play that, say that they try and shuffle, keep the blockade going, well, now we can win this pawn. And they can try and keep the blockade by keep shuffling their bishop, but now we come back, and if they keep shuffling, now we just push this pawn. And as they go over, now we go here, and the bishop is actually kind of trapped. Now, if the bishop tries to win this pawn is too dangerous, and they can't stop it. And you can try and come back, but we're going to promote. It's just, the thing is, this bishop, as good as a defender as it was, it's overloaded, and it couldn't handle all of that at once. Now, all of that was with the c5 idea, so let's go back to why that, of course that wasn't possible because of those reasons. Let's continue with what the main line we had here was. So if they come back, trying to avoid our c5 with tempo, we still play c5. But now the key is, very important, we're controlling this square. And this stops the bishop from shuffling, because now the bishop, the whole key of its defense was to shuffle and blockade. It can't do that because the square is now controlled, and they can't take this pawn because this is defended. So now the bishop is basically stuck between shuffling among these, between these two squares. So now this bishop is tied down, and that frees up our bishop and our king to try and get to this pawn, maybe to get to the pawn chain base here, and eventually white is going to win because of these key ideas. Now they can keep shuffling. We're going to try and get to their h-pawn. They're going to try and shadow us and make sure we don't get there. We come over here. They do the same. And we can just keep shuffling because our bishop, we can just pass the tempo. They can't really do the same because they're kind of stuck here. And you can do that for a little bit. But eventually, you're going to have to move at some point. Because the problem is these squares are controlled by our bishop. And so the king, when it does move, it's going to lose control of this pawn. So a really nice idea here is, say they move somewhere, doesn't matter, and we come up, and they come here. Same thing if they had shuffled the bishop, we'd get to the same position, doesn't really matter. We just want to be touching this pawn, so that if they ever run out of moves, this king has to leave the defense of their pawn. And so, of course, we can pass the tempo now, as long as we stay on this diagonal here. You could even come back further if you really wanted. You could even come over here if you wanted to. It doesn't really matter. I kind of like it here because we're keeping guard on this pawn too. But it doesn't really matter too much. The point is you just shuffle, and black is hopefully going to run out of moves. Now, if they just keep shuffling, you can start advancing. Maybe you could threaten something like this, try and prepare this. Maybe you could even sacrifice at some point. And so eventually they're going to run out of moves. Now, let's say they play king to g8, and give it up, this pawn, because there wasn't really a good way to hold it. Well, now you can take it, and they can try and come back, but eventually our king has now created this pass pawn, and that's going to decoy their king. And the reason I say eventually is because it's going to take a while for our pawn to get up here and force the king to defend this way. So I'll play the moves kind of quickly here, what that would look like. Kind of decoy this king almost like a magnet. And now we can just bring in our other attacking piece, which is the bishop. Not necessary, we could have kept pushing the pawn as well, but I kind of like this, kicks the king basically in the corner right away. But now, because this king has to try and defend our pawn, we're trying to get behind this pawn. And by doing so, it's going to be very difficult for them to hold this. They just simply can't stop us from getting to the base of their pawn chain. And so, they're going to have to stop our pass pawn. They can keep shuffling their bishop, but eventually we get behind their pawns. And as you can see, their pieces are just overloaded. So, they can try and shuffle their king now between these squares and try and maintain some control over the promotion square. But we can also just keep shuffling. And there's going to be a lot of shuffling in these bishop endgames, especially both sides, the opposite color bishop. But here, we're just going to win this pawn and threaten to create more pass pawns by taking this, and then all these pawns will be passed pawns. Or, well, that's the bishop. Or what we can do too is we can even go after this bishop because it's got so few squares to work with. So what that would look like is, say we go over here to this bishop. This bishop is actually trapped because it can't go to any of these squares without being taken by the king. This square is controlled by our pawn, doing a really nice job. And maybe they can try and sacrifice, the bishop for their pawn just so they get something for it. But when we capture back, now this pawn is a pass pawn. And this pawn was still a pass pawn. And also this pawn is a pass pawn. And there's so many things that the enemy king cannot defend against. It's just simply overloaded. So, they're going to move over. We're going to keep advancing. We're going to try and promote. And then show you, like, one sample checkmate here is, we could just promote here. And then when they move, just to just checkmate. So the point being, there are times where obstacle bishops can be pushed for a win. But oftentimes, even in this position, way back here, we had all of these things in white's favor. And even in this position, it was very difficult to kind of force this. I kind of sped up the process by having the king move back. You would probably even be longer if they had kept shuffling and we had even more things. I kind of want to keep the example short and kind of show as quick as I could the main ideas. So that way when you get into these endgames, you'll kind of know the ideas for both sides. How, each side can try and defend with the bishop by shuffling, by blockading their pawns. How the winning side will try and get their king more active to the enemy position. How they'll try and attack the base of the pawn chains, or create pass pawns their own. Like here, this would have been a nice pawn for us to win because then it creates a pass pawn. And so if you do all those things, eventually those pass pawns are going to become so strong that they won't be able to stop them, and then you'll just have a win. So you can't defend everything at once. That's your best open opposite color bishop endgames. But like I said, usually it's going to end up being a draw. And the reason this is important is because this is just the bishops and pawns. And like, okay, that's the common one. That's why I showed this example. But even if there's another minor piece, let's say both sides have opposite color bishop, a bunch of pawns, and maybe both sides have a rook. Even that endgame, that's going to be very highly drawish statistically because both sides have the opposite color bishops. You got to figure the rooks will probably trade for each other at some point. And even if you're up one or two pawns, the opposite color bishops might be able to hold some kind of defense. So that's a really nice idea to try and keep in mind. If you're the defending side, it looks like you're kind of slipping into some endgame that might be losing for you. You can try and trade into these opposite color bishops. And if you do so, you might have really good defending chances. Similarly, if you're the attacker, you don't want to trade too much into an endgame if you have the opposite color bishops. So that was a lot to say, but I hope it was instructional for everyone, and I will see you in the next chess video.